Good morning, everyone. How are we all today? I imagine a little cold, but I heard that's going to change soon. My name is Dr. Roger Narlock, and I'm director of the Benedictine Institute, and I welcome you to our first Lunch and Learn of the semester. At the end, I'll have a couple of announcements about upcoming programs, but I am up here initially to introduce our speaker for today, and her name is Donelle Poling. I want to say a few things about her. Donelle was a St. Ben's graduate with a double major in psychology and theology. She also got a master's degree in pastoral ministry from the School of Theology here at St. John's, and is currently working on her Doctor of Ministry at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. She has been involved for a long time with St. John's Youth in Theology and Ministry program, where you may have, especially if you're around in the summer, you see all the signs saying YTM. That's Donelle. She became director in 2020 and continues in that role of director of YTM, but is also the director of a 3-year program through the School of Theology called Conversatio, Creating a Culture of Encounter. And in this program, School of Theology Masters of Divinity students live in intentional community, developing cultural humility and participating in a Benedictine way of life. They do this while also serving local Catholic communities in youth ministry, faith formation, and liturgy. This program is rooted in the Benedictine practice of conversatio morum, which calls us to lifelong commitment to openness of heart, mind, and spirit. She'll, I'm sure, refer to those sorts of things during her presentation today, but I just want to finish with one fun fact about Donelle. She recently celebrated a milestone birthday, joining her sisters for a vacation in New York City, where they whooped it up in New York City by going to a 2 p.m. matinee Broadway show, followed by a 4:30 dinner, and they were all in bed at 10 p.m. for a blissful night's sleep. So we won't keep her out too long, but I ask you to welcome Donelle.
I won't have to tell you how old I am, just from that description. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Roger, and the Benedictine Institute for this opportunity. If there's one thing that I'm better at than anybody else in the room, it's humility. Yeah, insert. I really can't believe that I chose the subject of humility. Why in the world would I delve into this at a place and in front of people, especially our friends in the monastic community, where we think about humility, pray for it? Smart people here have written volumes and volumes about it, have expressed it in presentations and art, and we have a daily practice that invites us into this. What was I thinking? I did it in part because I have so much to learn about the subject of humility, and how better to do it than to immerse myself into it. I come to you today as a practitioner, not an expert. I also said yes because I'd also like to bring attention to the people in my life who have shown me what it means to practice humility. And lastly, like the title suggests, to invite all of us to move from right answers to cultural humility. In this rapidly changing, diverse world where our commitment to equity, inclusion, and justice are needed more than ever, I believe that the rule of Benedict and the practice of cultural humility have not only something to teach us, but a way to transform us. Today, I hope that Benedictine spirituality and cultural humility can be a conversation partners to help us on the path of inclusion. It is in our awareness, acknowledgement, and action that we can begin and continue to practice humility in our own lives, deepening and widening the places and spaces where we can welcome all. So what comes to mind when you hear the word humility? Anybody want to share? Shout it out. Yes. Meek? Huh. Anyone else? So you don't know everything, right? Jeannie? Something that you know is wrong, but you did it anyway, right? Yes. So humility is a word that once uttered, conjures up many different thoughts and images. Perhaps it's the etymology or the origin of the word as it pertains to the earth, right? Humus. I think of someone who is down to earth or grounded. Or perhaps the image of a physical trait of head bowed and eyes lowered comes to mind. Or maybe, perhaps, you remember someone who you know who emulates the quality in their own lives. Whatever image or thought comes to mind, I invite you to stop for a moment today and just think about as it pertains to you. I invite you to reflect on your own experience with practices of humility as I share mine today. And together, let's think about how this community supports those practices in ways that allow for mutual learning. Here we go. Let's see. Oops. Oh my goodness. Okay. There we go. Ladder of humility. St. Benedict's teaching on humility can be found at various places in the Rule, but mainly in the 7th chapter. So Benedict offers us an image of the ladder to mark the stages of development or conversion from fear to love. And according to Father Michael Casey in his book, Living the Truth, he says, as we grow in Christian life, we pass through different seasons of experience, each having its particular graces and distinctive challenges. Humility is necessary at all levels of growth, but its expression is different according to the measure of our progress. As a pastor, Benedict was aware that the area or activity or focus within the life and practices of a monk broadens in the course of a lifetime. So there are always new tricks to learn. An attitude or behavior that might have seemed uncomfortable or unattractive at an early stage of life may become more important later on. So the ladder of humility gives us a sequential account of the way in which humility manifests itself over a lifetime. There will be personal variations, but the process remains the same for most people. So essentially, it is presented as sequential, but we know that there's a fluidity among the stages of practicing humility. And Benedict offers us 12 steps to this ladder. I really appreciate this image that he gives us, but before I share with you the wise words and the 12 steps, I want to share a personal anecdote. When I was reflecting on humility and the times in my life when I've been most humbled and needed to practice it, there was a theme that emerged, and that theme is called parenting. Those of you who are parents probably know what I'm about to say. So I've never been humbled more in my life than in figuring out what I thought I knew, what I actually knew, and then admitting that I don't really know what I was doing, right? So I have a rare treat for you. I have a picture of the actual moment I became a parent. Yeah, I'm not even on any of the rungs, actually. But here is the picture of the day we became parents. Incidentally, Johnny, class of 93, Benny, class of 95, and then Magdalena, hopefully class of 2027. We built our family through adoption. And as sobering as the journey was up until that point, we would have many opportunities after this day to practice the steps of humility. We traveled to Colombia to be united with Magdalena, and 4 years later, our son Charles. And each time, we lived there for about 3 months with Magdalena before returning home. So being new parents, the daily lessons of not knowing never stopped. Not only were we trying to figure out if her sniffles were enough to call in the entire Bogota medical team, hint, they were not, we were trying to parent for the first time in a new place and a new culture. We had the opportunity to climb a ladder every single day. And although we didn't have the language for it then, we were immersed in the practice of cultural humility. And we still are today. So the concept of cultural humility was first introduced by medical researchers in the healthcare field. Melanie Trevelyan and Jan Murray Garcia in 1998 defined cultural humility as a lifelong process that involves self-reflection and self-critique, and a willingness to listen and learn from others who have different backgrounds and perspectives. This means that individuals with cultural humility are able to approach other cultures with an open mind and are willing to listen and learn from those who may have different experiences and viewpoints without imposing their own bias and their own assumptions. This personal, lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and self-critique invites the individual not only to learn about another's culture, but one that starts with an examination of his or her own beliefs and cultural identities. Does this sound familiar? Open mind, willing to listen, not imposing, examination of self, lifelong commitment to growth and formation. Let's get back to Benedict and that ladder. So what are these steps of the ladder? Now, just to give you some insight into how my brain works, I've developed a chart. And you can't, I made it small just because I don't want to get bogged down in this chart, right? But this is how my brain works and how I approach things. So when I began to reflect on this, I gathered sources to help me understand. Remember, I was educated here, so I know how to do this well. And just to tell you that some haven't even made it to this chart, and it's ever evolving. But I used, for my particular prayer and reflection, 5 sources, and the Rule of Benedict itself, right, chapter 7, but also Benedict's sources on the Rule of Master and John Cashin. And I also use scripture, Father Michael Casey's book, Living the Truth, Sister Judith Sutera's, who is a Benedictine from Atchison, her daily commentary on the Rule in inclusive language. And then one of my favorite sisters is Sister Joan Chittister from Erie, Pennsylvania. So don't worry, I'm not going to go through them one by one. Not because that they aren't important or worth it, just that I couldn't possibly do this justice. So I hope that it sparks some curiosity for you to really delve into this and be in conversation with somebody that is far more well-versed than I am in this. But I do share with you an extremely concise version, so eloquently given to us by Sister Joan, just to give an overview of the 12 steps of the ladder. Ready? Number 1, God is God. Number 2, God's will is best for you. Number 3, seek direction from wisdom figures. Number 4, endure the pains of development and don't give up. Acknowledge your faults and strip away your masks. Be content with less than the best. Let go of a false sense of self. Preserve tradition and learn from the community. Listen. Never ridicule anyone or anything. Speak kindly. Be serene, stay calm, and then melt into the heart of God. Isn't that beautiful? Benedict's ladder of humility helps us frame the complex approach in such a way that we can begin again and again, not to get it right, but rather to be changed into love itself. Over the past 2 years, I've been learning in the realm of the DEIJ and global equity space, taking workshops and attending lectures, reading articles and books to expand my learning. Our own institution at St. Ben's and St. John's has a wonderful professional development opportunities that have enlightened and challenged me. I've been gaining knowledge and skills toward interculturality and still have so much to learn. Sometimes my head spins at the thought of how much I need to learn to contribute to my work at the School of Theology. But interestingly enough, when I'm in spaces and classrooms learning about cultural humility in a non-religious setting, my brain and my heart always returns back to the rule. This relationship between the rule of Benedict and cultural humility can assist all of us in moving toward a more inclusive community, in particular to our context here. What can we learn from experiences and practices of others? And how can we move forward to make this more of an inclusive community? As I learned and prayed with the ladder of humility and examined my own experiences and considered the field of cultural humility, I offer these 3 approaches or stances toward humility for our thoughts today. Certainly not a ladder, but perhaps more of a step stool, or even better, just 3 faithful steps that we can all take. I offer these as descriptive, not prescriptive by any means. Awareness. What does it mean to be aware? Aware of what? St. Benedict suggests that this is to know that God is God and we are not. Thy will be done. He invites us to be aware of the attachments in our lives that impede our relationship with God and others. And then cultural humility tells us that awareness of our biases and preconceived notions about others are helpful ways to enter into the practice. So what about you? What about us? What are things we need to be aware of in order to practice this approach of humility? What can we engage in to become more aware of the other? So the faithful step here is to check ourselves, asking questions that make us pause. When we hear something about someone who's different from us or doesn't think like we do, we could ask ourselves, could there be another perspective different than mine that has value? Am I listening? How am I listening? Or am I just waiting to respond? The second step I offer is one of acknowledgement. What are we acknowledging? In Benedictine spirituality, it suggests that we acknowledge our own sinfulness or our false selves and the masks that we wear to inflate ourselves at the cost of another's dignity. The acknowledgement that we need others is also important. We cannot do this alone, and community is needed to hold us accountable, and it's needed for our well-being. Cultural humility reveals that to acknowledge another means to honor one's beliefs, their customs and values, and acknowledge the difference. It also means to accept people for who they are, where they are in their life. It encourages us to look at the structure of power and power imbalances and name those, and to recognize that differences may exist because one power group has power over the other. So the faithful step here is the invitation to acknowledge that others can teach us something, and we can learn from it. It is not only recognizing that we do not know all, but to be open to learning from all people. And then the third and final step is this approach. To this approach is action. For Benedictine spirituality, this always begins with listening. Listening is the action needed, and then it's suggested to practice silence. Father Casey suggests that humility is not an action, nor a sequence of actions, not a habit formed by repetitive of actions. It is receptivity, a fundamental stance before God. For St. Benedict, humility becomes the primary disposition of our hearts. It is how we approach relationships, how we approach communication, our work, how we approach difference and otherness. This isn't inaction. It takes on a contemplative stance and approach. For our friends in the cultural humility realm, action looks more like typically of what we would think of as action. They encourage us to develop partnerships with people and groups who advocate for others, holding ourselves and others accountable, including the institutions that we work for, so that we can create equitable policies, procedures, and practices. So the question might be, how do we as groups and institutions and as community support or inhibit cultural humility, respect, and inclusion? Cultural humility is developed by being self-aware and holding each other accountable. So the faithful step here is to begin with listening to the word, to the wisdom of the elders, and especially to the need and the voice of others, and to move to inclusion and empowerment of those who don't have a place or haven't been invited or are underrepresented. I offer these 3 ways of awareness, acknowledgement, and action as a way to begin or continue, wherever you're at, this approach towards humility. And I hope that you've recognized in yourself the ways in which you've already practiced them. I'd like you to meet someone who practiced this quite well. His name is John. And 28 years ago, when I married my husband, John became my uncle. And a great uncle he was. He was born at a time when the way in dealing with someone who was different was to place them in an institution. In fact, the doctor told his mom to make an appointment to tour the facility where they could place him, and that was the expectation. And being the dutiful patient that she was, she followed doctor's orders and made the appointment. She took the tour with John, and being the dutiful mother that she was, she then promptly returned to the car with John and rode home and never looked back. She was devoted to him and his well-being. So John succeeded at many things. He learned to read and write. He went to school. He loved movies. He had over 400 DVDs. That was his thing. But the best thing that John succeeded at was his relationships. He was the one in the front row of our wedding. Incidentally, the whole wedding party had to move back a pew because he took the front row. And he was crying his eyes out in joy over his nephew marrying me. And he was the one who would show up at every birthday party with his guitar, and he would serenade the birthday person and everyone else with the birthday party song, even if it wasn't yours. It was out of tune, and he had no idea how to play the guitar, by the way. When John cried, we all felt what he was feeling. When John laughed, it could be heard for blocks. He also had a vocabulary or his own language, all his own, quirky sayings all the time. So instead of saying, "I'm so impressed," with something that astounded him, he'd say, "Oh, I'm so oppressed." He called me Cupcake. That was my nickname, which I thought was really special until I learned that he also called my husband Cupcake and the woman at Target that was checking us out Cupcake. You get the sense, right? So John let you into his life wholeheartedly. He memorized birthdays and special days, and he remembered it and acknowledged it. So when John greeted you, he would state out loud to you the description of your relationship. So this is how and then offer you a kind word. This is how it would go. "Hi, Nellie," that's me. "Hi, Uncle John. You are a good niece to me. And you are a good wife to your husband, and you are a good mother to your children, and a good daughter to your mother." And this would go on and on. This happened repeatedly for 28 years. It wasn't he needed to do this. He just did it as his practice. He named it. John lived into awareness like no other. He was aware of who he was. He accepted everyone for who they were fully. He didn't live into the restrictions of his limitations, but fully embraced what he could offer. One of my favorite qualities of John was that when he made mistakes, I was his PCA for many years he lived with us, so I got to know his mistakes quite well, as anybody. But he would take them to heart, and he'd look at me straight in the eye, and instead of saying he was sorry, he would just say, "Well, I'm not perfect." I'm just recalling. He knew when he screwed up, and he did screw up, but he acknowledged it. Now, Uncle John didn't profess his love of God in words, but the actions he took in his life and what I want to share with you today, that his overall disposition was love. There wasn't anything he wanted from you other than just to be with you. So John, for me, is the embodiment of humility. Some might say that I've reduced this too simply, but I don't think so. John was an example of this practice, through and through. I also share it because John was other his whole life. He was different. In a world where intellect, able-bodied people are revered and looked upon to be the teachers, here is one of my greatest teachers, Uncle John. He embraced the pathway of God through humility. His ascent of the ladder was aided because of his otherness, and his overall disposition was love. St. Benedict concludes the prologue to the rule by noting, "As we progress in this way of life and in faith, we shall run on the path of God's commandments, our hearts overflowing with the inexpressible delight of love. May the path of humility lead us closer to Christ's love, renewing our hearts so that we may begin again." My gratitude for you today and your time. Thank you.
We do have some time for questions. If, Donelle, you would be happy to take a couple of questions. Raise a hand, and anybody want to shout out a question for Donelle?
Just for someone who's never heard the concept of cultural humility,
Yes.
and coming to this new, how do you present a topic like this to someone who has never heard of it? How do you start having these conversations with people about humility and cultural humility and kind of making this happen? How do you what's a good jumping off point to start talking to other people about it?
That's a great question. What is your name? Lisa. Thank you. How I do this first is model it. I would say that would be, for me, the first point of access is to enter into the conversation with that person. But I would also say it's as simple as just becoming aware of difference or becoming aware of how you are in that situation. So again, that sense of awareness, and maybe it doesn't lead to the other steps. Maybe it isn't sequential, but maybe you just practice that awareness in different times during the day, and then talk about that with others, because it doesn't require even knowing anything about what I was saying other than just saying, okay, how am I feeling in this moment? Or also, why is that person, why do I have a reaction to what they're saying, right? Or differences. So I think everybody can take that first faithful step of becoming aware. And there's also a lot of, if you enter things through the intellect and through the mind, meaning you like to do research, there's a lot in the realm of cultural humility and global equity workshops, and again, healthcare professionals, historically, they're the ones that have developed this field because they would enter into a hospital room and not know who was there. And so instead of presuming to know the answers, that they really had to step back and listen. Thank you for that. Any other questions? Yes, Julian.
Any suggestions on reading for parents? I find myself struggling. We have 2 boys and then a girl, and the girl is our youngest. And I find myself struggling with how to give her advice because I want to mentor, I want to show, I want her to grow in humility, and yet gender issues being what they are, I see situations in which she is being told to make herself small and to not take up space, and I'm really struggling with that, especially now that she's a teenager. Any references you can point me in the direction?
Yes, there's a book called Conscious Parenting. I don't know if you're familiar with that. She's actually practicing Hindu, I believe, but she approaches parenting with a spiritual consciousness. That's helped me. I would also say that there's a paradox here of humility, that it's we could go on and on about what this means, but that it's not self-denial to the detriment of the person. It's actually in self-transformation, and to be able to surround ourselves with people who can help us practice that. And with anything that's in practicing, that you're going to make mistakes for sure. But that, again, surrounding ourselves with that mentality of helping and creating that safe space for her to learn how to do that, and for you as well. Thank you. That was nice. Any other questions? Yes.
Mine is kind of, I would say, plays off of that, but you had mentioned about being your true self, or, like letting that through. The first thing that came to mind was imposter syndrome and how you deal with that for humility of, because that is not humility. That is kind of denying who your true self is, of that play for professional women, I would say, especially. How does that kind of, or have you looked at that or seen that?
Yeah, I've also experienced that about 20 minutes ago. I think this is where the role of the community really helps me. So I'll just speak to that, the role of community in affirming and challenging and holding myself accountable to all that means in building up healthy humility. And in fact, that's probably one of the greatest things about working here is that I'm able to be with and surround myself with people who understand that and can process that with me and affirm it. So I would say the role of community. Any others? All right, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Donelle. That was wonderful. This is one of the topics that I think is so important, and clearly issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion are so prominent, and we're delving into these so much as a campus. And I just appreciate your ability to sort of think this through from a Benedictine point of view, because that's something that I think we are called to do on these as a function of being part of these campus communities. But sometimes that doesn't always happen. So I thank you for such a thoughtful treatment. of this. If you are interested in that connection between Benedictine ideas and DEIJ issues, diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice issues, there are two sources available, one in the past but is still available to you, and one coming up. Last spring, the Benedictine Institute hosted a series of 3 speakers on Benedictine perspectives on DEIJ, and those videos are still posted on our website. If you go to our website, you'll be able to find them very easily. And if you're going to start with one of them, I would probably recommend the one by Nick Tangen, who did just a wonderful job, as Donelle did, in exploring what these issues might look like from an explicitly Benedictine point of view. The other opportunity is that Jessie Bazan, who is now in the back of the room, you may have checked in with her as you came in. She is working some for the Benedictine Institute this semester, and one of the things that we're planning is a follow-up, more of a conversational follow-up in regard to both Donelle's talk and some of the talks that we did, that these DEIJ talks that we held last spring, so that we can have smaller groups engage in more conversation and exploring what this might look like. We don't have times and places for those set yet, but they will likely be mid to late February. And as always, look in the Daily Bulletin for those, and you will see them advertised for there. A few other announcements before I let you go. First of all, our next Lunch and Learn is actually coming pretty quickly. It's on February 24th. We usually don't put these so close together, but we had the opportunity of having our next speaker be somebody from the outside who's going to be here on campus, and his name is Jeff Corgan. And he is one of the people in charge of leading the charge for Dorothy Day's sainthood. And so he'll be on campus, and what he's going to talk about at our Lunch and Learn is explicitly Dorothy Day as a Benedictine, because Dorothy Day was a Benedictine oblate, which means that even as a non-monastic person, she subscribed to a Benedictine way of life, and that is very much behind her work and the pattern of her life. And so he's going to speak more about that on the 24th. You can look next week, I believe, on the Daily Bulletin. There will be signups for that. The next thing I'd like to draw your attention to is I would love to hear from any of you who know of any first-year students who might be interested in living out a Benedictine way of life in a more intentional way. The Benedictine Institute runs a program in conjunction with the St. John's Abbey and St. Benedict's Monastery called the Benedictine Living and Learning Community. And it's primarily for sophomore students where they then live together in an area and they try to live out these Benedictine practices. They take a 1-credit class together on Benedictine spirituality and try and embed that in their day-to-day living. But of course, first-year students are still trying to understand what this whole Benedictine thing is, so they don't always know what they may be looking for. So if you have any suggestions of first-year students, please email me or email the Benedictine Institute or Catherine Rupp, and we would be happy to send out an email to them and nudge them on your behalf. We would greatly appreciate that. There's signups. The signups are coming pretty soon for that. And lastly, one of the things, of course, that the Benedictine Institute always hosts is every Friday a time to get together with no agenda and just be in each other's presence, and also the presence of coffee and donuts. And so our building community program every Friday morning from 9 to 10:45, we welcome any and all of you to show up for as little or as much time as you have available to you. This Friday, it's going to be at St. Ben's and in a new location. We've never had it at Ricarda Hall before, but it'll be in Ricarda Hall, right in the front foyer area there, again from 9 to 10:45. So if you can venture over there, we would love to chat with you more. So once again, one more round of applause for Donelle.